I want you to picture this. Before most of New York finished breakfast, federal marshals were already inside some of Manhattan's most recognizable buildings. Not for a raid, not for a warning, but for something far more final. A court-ordered seizure. In a single morning, decades of empire building tied to Donald Trump moved from private control into court supervision. No negotiations, no extensions, no hesitation. Here's the mistake most people make. They think this story is about Trump. It isn't. This is about what happens when a legal system decides that defiance has reached its limit. For weeks, Trump went silent. No appeals, no noise, no bond. And silence in enforcement cases like this is never neutral. It is a signal. Stay with me. Because once you understand why silence triggered action, you will understand something much bigger about power, money, and the system you live under today. And once you see it, you won't unsee it. This is where the line finally broke. Now let me slow this down, because this is where most coverage gets it wrong. What happened was not sudden, and it was not emotional. It was mechanical. This was the predictable endpoint of a legal system that had been warning for months. Comply, or the system will move without you. The core problem was never politics. It was credibility. A court issued a civil fraud judgment. The law gave the defendant one clear option: post the bond, preserve the appeal, pause enforcement. That option was not taken. And when a defendant with vast claimed wealth cannot or will not secure a bond, the system stops asking questions and starts executing procedures. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Modern legal systems are designed to tolerate defiance only up to a point. After that, delay becomes risk, silence becomes threat, and hesitation becomes institutional weakness. So the question was no longer whether enforcement would happen. The only remaining question was how fast. And once that threshold is crossed, everything changes. Because the moment enforcement begins, control is no longer negotiable. And that takes us directly to where this really started. To understand why the system moved the way it did, you have to step back. New York's financial enforcement framework was not built for spectacle. It was built for repetition. For decades, regulators watched a pattern repeat itself. Inflated valuations, favorable loan terms, insurance priced on numbers that lived more on paper than in reality. Most cases never reached this scale because most defendants corrected course before the system hardened. But this case didn't follow that path. What made it different was duration. Years of misrepresentation, years of leverage built on trust the system assumed was real. Civil fraud law in New York is designed around one core idea. Markets only function when numbers mean something. Once false numbers are tolerated, the damage doesn't stop with one company. It spreads. That is why the remedy was never just financial. It was structural. Bans, oversight, court supervision. When the judgment arrived, it wasn't the beginning of punishment. It was the end of tolerance. And from that moment on, every procedural requirement became a test. Post the bond or reveal something deeper, that test is what triggered the first real rupture. The first real rupture didn't come with headlines. It came with silence. For months, the response had followed a familiar rhythm: motions, appeals, public defiance, procedural delay. That rhythm was how time was bought. That rhythm was how pressure was managed. Then it stopped. Appeal activity slowed without explanation. Corporate roles shifted quietly. Subsidiaries moved. And most importantly, the bond was not posted. In enforcement cases of this size, failure to secure a bond is not a technical oversight. It is a signal. It tells the system one of three things: inability, intentional delay, or disregard for authority. And sometimes it tells all three at once. Behind the scenes, insurance firms declined. Bonding agencies stepped away. Institutions that once welcomed business suddenly found reasons not to engage. 30 refusals are not coincidence. They are consensus. This is the moment most viewers miss. Enforcement doesn't react to noise. It reacts to risk. If you want to understand how power actually works, stay with me. because this silence forced the system to choose between hesitation and credibility. And once that choice was made, there was no reversing it. That decision set the clock running. Here is the part most people never see. Enforcement is not about punishment. It is about control. Once the bond failed, the system stopped debating intent and started mapping exposure. Not personalities, not politics, assets, titles, revenue streams, ownership chains. This is where the machinery becomes visible. Courts don't seize randomly. They identify the financial nervous system, the assets that generate cash, the properties that fund operations, the accounts that keep everything alive. You don't cut the limbs. You cut the circulation. That is why enforcement moved toward commercial properties first. Clear titles, predictable income, minimal legal friction. Every selection reduced the defendant's ability to maneuver while accelerating compliance. And notice what did not happen. No dramatic personal raids, no symbolic gestures, no assets that could stall proceedings for years. This wasn't escalation. It was optimization. The system acted the way it was designed to act when delay becomes dangerous, quietly, precisely, relentlessly. At this stage, outcomes stop depending on arguments and start depending on math. Asset value versus judgment size, liquidity versus time, resistance versus authority. Once that calculation turns negative, enforcement doesn't ask again. It moves, and that movement is what produced the second, far more visible crisis. What happened next was the moment everything became visible. This was no longer paperwork. This was physical control. Within hours of authorization, enforcement officers moved into place. Buildings were secured, management was notified, tenants were informed, accounts were frozen. Court supervision began before confusion could turn into resistance. Speed mattered here. The faster enforcement acts, the fewer escape routes remain, no last-minute transfers, no quiet restructuring, no leverage left to deploy, every hour reduced optionality. This is why the seizures felt shocking, not because they were aggressive, but because they were prepared long before anyone saw them coming. The targets were deliberate: revenue-producing properties, clean ownership chains, assets that sustained daily operations. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about inevitability. By the time the public noticed federal marshals in lobbies, the real work was already done. Control had shifted. Decisions now required approval. Cash flow was redirected. The system had taken the wheel. At that point, resistance stops being strategic and starts becoming symbolic. And symbolic resistance doesn't slow enforcement. It accelerates it. Because once the machinery is in motion, it doesn't negotiate. It completes its mandate. And that's when the consequences stopped being abstract and started reaching people directly. Now, this is where it stops being abstract. Because while headlines focus on buildings and balance sheets, the real impact moves outward toward people who never signed a loan document or argued in a courtroom. If you are a tenant, your lease is suddenly reviewed. If you are an employee, your paycheck now flows through court supervision. If you are a vendor, payments slow, pause, or require approval. And if you are watching this as a citizen, something deeper settles in. You realize that power is not just loud speeches or confident branding. Power is compliance. Power is whether systems still work when someone refuses to play along. This moment forces an uncomfortable question on you. If a system can move this decisively against someone this powerful, what does that mean for everyone else? Some will feel reassurance. Others will feel fear. But no one remains untouched. If this matters to you, if accountability matters, stay here. Share this. Talk about it. Because systems only hold when people understand how they actually operate. And once you see how quickly stability can shift, you start looking at the world differently. That shift doesn't stop at state lines. What happened in New York did not stay in New York. Global investors watch enforcement, not speeches. They watch whether courts act when pressure rises. They watch whether rules bend for power or absorb it. This moment sent a signal far beyond American borders. In financial capitals around the world, regulators took note. Markets that rely on trust noticed something critical: a system willing to enforce judgments at scale, against visibility, against political noise. That matters, because modern capital flows toward predictability, not personalities. When enforcement becomes credible, risk recalibrates, deals change, assumptions shift. The cost of bending rules quietly goes up. This is how legal authority becomes geopolitical leverage, not through threats, but through consistency. And there's another layer. For democracies under strain, this moment becomes a reference point, proof that institutions can still function under pressure, proof that enforcement does not require consensus, only resolve. But credibility cuts both ways. When systems act this decisively, they also raise expectations. Future failures become harder to explain. Selective enforcement becomes more visible. Neutrality becomes non-negotiable. This is how a domestic legal action turns into a global stress test. And stress tests always force the same question: what happens next? That depends on which future the system chooses. From here, the system faces three possible paths. The first is stabilization. Enforcement completes its mandate. Assets are liquidated, judgments are satisfied, oversight works, the system proves that rules once triggered finish their course. In this outcome, institutions regain credibility, and the shock slowly settles into precedent. The second path is contestation. Appeals multiply. Constitutional arguments intensify. Political narratives harden. Enforcement continues, but under constant pressure. This is where legitimacy is tested not by law, but by endurance. The system still functions, but every step costs more trust. The third path is destabilization. Resistance escalates faster than resolution. Legal battles drain resources. Parallel crises converge. What began as enforcement becomes a prolonged stress event, one that consumes attention, capital, and institutional bandwidth. Not because the law failed, but because everything collided at once. None of these futures is chosen by rhetoric. They are chosen by behavior. Systems don't respond to outrage. They respond to compliance, capacity, and time. What matters now is whether enforcement closes this chapter or opens a longer one, whether this moment becomes a boundary or a breach. Because once enforcement reaches this scale, reversal becomes nearly impossible. Only outcomes change, and that brings us to the final question. What does this moment actually mean, and why will it matter long after the headlines fade? Here is the insight that matters long after the footage fades. This was never just about one man or one empire. It was about whether systems still close their loops. For decades, power learned how to delay, how to negotiate consequences, how to turn judgments into noise. What changed here was not the law. It was the willingness to finish. When enforcement actually completes its mandate, myths collapse. The myth of infinite leverage, the myth of negotiated reality, the myth that scale alone creates immunity. This moment tells you something essential about the world you live in. Systems don't fail all at once. They fail when accountability becomes optional. And they recover when enforcement becomes boring, procedural, and unavoidable again. That is what you witnessed. If this analysis helped you see the structure behind the spectacle, stay with me. Share this. Subscribe. Because the next phase won't be louder, it will be quieter, more technical, and more consequential. Power doesn't end with a headline. It ends when systems stop blinking. And the system blinked today.